The road, what was left of it, dwindled to a gravel track that clawed its way through a dense, unkempt forest. My vintage pickup, usually a beacon of reliability, grumbled in protest, its tires spitting loose stones. I gripped the wheel tighter, the leather worn smooth beneath my palms, a testament to years of careful handling. Every scratch, every scuff on the dashboard, held a story I could recall with perfect clarity. That's how I operate, details matter. In my work, restoring forgotten antiques, the smallest chip, the faintest patina, speaks volumes. It's a language I understand, a history I meticulously uncover and preserve. This manor, though, felt like a language I hadn't yet learned, a history that actively resisted being known. The will had been clear, if impersonal. A distant great-aunt, a name I barely recognized, had bequeathed the property to me. No explanation, no fond memories, just a cold legal document delivered by a solicitor whose face was as gray as his suit. He'd mentioned the place was a bit of a project. An understatement, I suspected, given the way the solicitor had subtly shivered when he handed me the keys, as if the chill of the house had already seeped into his bones. Finally, the trees parted, revealing the manor. Stone walls, once proud, now sagged, choked by ivy that resembled grasping skeletal hands. Windows stared out like vacant eyes, some shattered, others opaque with generations of grime. The roofline sagged in places, hinting at collapsing timbers within. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, stood agape, an unwelcome invitation. This wasn't just a house, it was a tomb. A grand, sprawling tomb, waiting. The air was still, heavy, tasting of dust and something vaguely metallic, like old pennies left in the rain. I squinted up at the manor. My restorers, I immediately began cataloging the damage: crumbling mortar, rotted window frames, a missing gargoyle from the west turret. The scale of the task was immense, overwhelming, yet a familiar spark of determination ignited within me. This was a challenge, a grand, forgotten piece of architecture crying out for careful hands. The front door, a monstrous slab of oak studded with iron, groaned like a dying beast as I pushed it open. Inside, a wave of stale, frigid air washed over me, carrying the scent of mildew, old paper, and something indescribably dry, like dust that had never known moisture. The grand entrance hall was a cavern of gloom. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light filtering through a grimy stained glass window high above, illuminating the ghostly shapes of draped furniture. It felt as though I had stepped into a stopped clock, a moment frozen for decades. My footsteps echoed, each sound magnified, swallowed by the vast, empty spaces. This house had not merely been left, it had been abandoned, forgotten. But who forgets a place like this? My initial survey was methodical. I moved from room to room on the ground floor, checking the structural integrity, assessing the damage. Each space offered a similar tableau: shrouded furniture, peeling wallpaper, a pervasive sense of desolation. I found myself descending a narrow, winding staircase that seemed to have been an afterthought, tucked away behind the main kitchen. The steps creaked beneath my weight, complaining with every footfall. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door, devoid of any handle, stood slightly ajar. A low, rhythmic thrumming sound, faint but insistent, pulsed from beyond it. Curiosity, a professional instinct I'd honed over years, pulled me forward. I pushed the door open wider. Before me lay the laundry room with humming machines. It was surprisingly intact, a stark contrast to the decay upstairs. 3 hulking, industrial-sized washing machines and 2 enormous dryers dominated the space, their enamel faded but not shattered. And they were all humming. A deep, resonant thrum vibrated through the concrete floor, a sound that felt more like a low growl than mechanical operation. My flashlight beam swept across them. No power cords were visibly plugged in. Yet the humming persisted, a consistent, almost organic drone that seemed to emanate from the very core of the machines, or perhaps, from the walls themselves. It wasn't a loud hum, but a pervasive one, a low-frequency vibration that settled deep in my chest. I pressed my ear against the cold metal of one of the washing machines. The hum was louder here, a steady, internal vibration, like a massive, dormant heart. The air here was damp, heavy with the faint, cloying scent of stale detergent and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood and rust. I moved slowly, cautiously, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a broken electrical circuit, it was an impossible anomaly. My meticulous nature demanded an explanation, a logical sequence of cause and effect. But here, in this humming room, logic seemed to have taken a vacation. I reached out, my fingers hovering inches from the surface of a dryer. It felt cool, not warm as if recently used. The humming was constant, unwavering. There was no vibration in the floor that would suggest a generator, no distant hum of power lines. Just these dead machines, humming. A sudden, faint click, like a latch disengaging, echoed from somewhere above, from the floor I had just left. I froze, my hands still suspended in the air. The humming of the machine seemed to intensify, ever so slightly, or perhaps it was just my heightened awareness. My breath hitched. I wasn't alone. And the house, I realized with a sudden, sickening jolt, had just welcomed me in. The manor house loomed, a hulking silhouette against the bruised morning sky. I spent my first full day just walking its cavernous rooms, a silent appraisal. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the decay. It was worse, and more magnificent, than I'd imagined. Every peeling fresco, every splintered newel post, whispered of a grandeur long lost, a challenge I felt uniquely qualified to meet. My first order of business was to establish a workspace. The old ballroom, with its high ceilings and cracked parquet floor, seemed the most practical. I cleared a corner, sweeping aside decades of debris, and laid down heavy canvas tarps. My tools, usually arranged with surgical precision, were still mostly packed in their cases, but I pulled out a few essentials, a selection of chisels, a block plane, a set of fine grit sandpaper, and a tin of wood conditioner. I started small, with a single, water-damaged side table I'd found overturned in the library. Its delicate inlay was warped, its legs bowed, but I saw the ghost of its former beauty. I worked methodically, the rasp of the plane against the soft pine, the whisper of sandpaper, the only sounds in the vast, echoing space. Hours bled into one another. The light outside softened, then deepened to gold. I paused, stretching my stiff back, and reached for my small, brass-handled mallet. It wasn't there. I frowned. I always kept it to my right, nestled beside the chisels. My gaze swept the tarp, then the floor around it. Nothing. Must be getting tired, I muttered to myself, rubbing my temples. I distinctly remembered putting it down. I walked to my toolbox, thinking I might have put it away prematurely. No, it wasn't there either. A prickle of annoyance, not alarm, stirred in me. I was meticulous to a fault. This was unlike me. I shrugged it off, grabbing a larger, heavier mallet from the box instead. Old houses, I reasoned, had a way of disorienting you. Later, as the last vestiges of daylight faded, I decided I needed to get some of the grime off my work clothes. I'd seen a utility room off the back kitchen that looked like it housed laundry facilities. Navigating the unfamiliar passages by the beam of my headlamp, I found the door. It opened into a small, damp space, smelling faintly of mildew and old soap. Two industrial-sized machines, their enamel faded and chipped, squatted against the far wall. This was the laundry room with humming machines. Even in their dormant state, they seemed to vibrate with a latent energy, a low, almost imperceptible thrum that I could feel more than hear. I tossed my dust-laden shirt and trousers into the older of the two washers, adding a scoop of detergent. The rhythmic sloshing and whirring filled the small room, a temporary, comforting barrier against the isolation. I leaned against the doorframe, letting the artificial noise wash over me, my mind still replaying the day's work on the side table. That's when I heard it. A soft, distinct scrape, like something dragging across wood, coming from the direction of the ballroom. I froze, my internal monologue snapping shut. The sound was faint, barely audible over the washing machine's churn, but it was there. It wasn't a settling house noise, it had a deliberate quality. I held my breath, straining to hear over the din. The scrape didn't repeat. It was just a single, drawn-out shhk. My eyes darted around the dim laundry room, then to the dark hallway beyond. My rational mind immediately offered explanations, a branch scraping against a window outside, perhaps a rodent. But the sound had come from inside. And it had sounded too heavy for a mouse, too precise for a branch. I waited until the washing machine moved into its rinse cycle, its noise subsiding slightly. My skin prickled. When the washer finally shuddered to a halt, I retrieved my damp clothes, my movements stiff and quick. I didn't linger. I pulled the laundry basket into the main hallway, away from the immediate vicinity of the ballroom, and hung my clothes over a rickety drying rack I'd found. I decided to check the ballroom. The vast space was exactly as I'd left it. The side table sat on my tarp, half restored. My tools were where they should be, save for the missing brass mallet. I swept the beam across the floor, looking for any displaced dust, any sign. Nothing. Then, as I turned to leave, the beam caught on something. Tucked beneath the leg of the side table, almost entirely hidden by the tarp, was a small, ornate wooden box. It wasn't one of mine. It had been buried under decades of dust and debris when I'd cleared the space, but now it was sitting on top of the tarp, just peeking out from under the table. I knew, with absolute certainty, that it hadn't been there when I'd finished working. I would have seen it. I was meticulous. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I knelt. The wood felt cool and smooth beneath my fingertips, despite its age. It had no visible latch or clasp, just a seamless, almost invisible seam where the lid met the body. My eyes scanned the room, the immense, empty space suddenly feeling less empty, more observant. I didn't feel alone anymore. I felt watched. It was worse, and more magnificent, than I'd anticipated. The sheer scale of the undertaking threatened to swallow me whole, but the challenge sharpened my resolve. This wasn't just a house, it was a vast, intricate puzzle, waiting for my touch. My initial days dissolved into a rhythm of methodical exploration and meticulous cleaning. I started with the ground floor, each room a testament to decades of neglect. Cobwebs draped from every chandelier, thick as old lace. I wore a mask, not just for the dust, but for that persistent, indefinable scent that prickled at the back of my throat. My clothes were stiff with dust and the pervasive manor scent. I followed the faint rumble of pipes, a low, distant groan that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the house. It led me down a narrow, unlit servants' passage, past peeling wallpaper and closed, heavy doors, into a surprisingly functional space. The laundry room with humming machines was tucked away in the back corner of the basement, a stark contrast to the rest of the decaying grandeur. The air here was warm and humid, smelling of old detergent and something vaguely metallic again, stronger now. I fed my dusty work clothes into one of the washers, the hum of the mechanism a surprisingly comforting sound, a whisper of the living world in this mausoleum. For a moment, I stood there, watching the suds churn, feeling the vibrations through the concrete floor. I tried to recall what I'd been doing just before deciding to come down here, the exact thought that had prompted it. It felt distant. Like a word on the tip of my tongue, just out of reach. I frowned, dismissing it as fatigue. The house was a drain, physically and mentally. My focus soon shifted to the library, a vast chamber lined with towering, oak bookcases. Most of the books were ruined, their leather bindings cracked, their pages fused by damp. But the shelves themselves were magnificent, built into the very walls. I was running a gloved hand along the base of a particularly ornate section, tracing the intricate carvings, when my fingers snagged on an anomaly. A faint seam, almost imperceptible, ran vertically down one of the carved pilasters. My restorer's eye, trained to spot the minutiae of construction, recognized it instantly. This wasn't just decoration. This was a joint. A hidden compartment. My heart gave a small, professional leap. This was the kind of discovery that made the endless toil worthwhile. I spent the next hour, gently probing, pressing, and inspecting. The mechanism was subtle, a spring-loaded catch disguised as a knot in the wood grain. With a soft click, a narrow section of the bookcase, perhaps a foot wide and 6 feet tall, swung inwards, revealing a shallow recess. Inside, nestled on a velvet-lined shelf, lay a single, leather-bound journal. It was small, unassuming, its cover worn smooth by time, secured with a tarnished brass clasp. No title, no author. Back in the main library, beneath the dim light filtering through the grimy windows, I unfastened the clasp. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. The script was an elegant, looping hand, dated from the late 1700s. It wasn't a personal diary, not exactly. The entries were sparse, fragmented. Many spoke of the seasons, the weather, the occasional visitor. But interwoven with these mundane details were increasingly unsettling observations. The house grows quiet. A different kind of quiet than before. It wanes. He forgets his own name, sometimes. It hungers. It wears away the edges. What was I doing just now? The thought escapes me, like a wisp of smoke. I traced the words with my finger, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The last entry was brief, almost illegible, just a shaky series of lines that looked like a bird's scratchings, ending with a single, stark word, gone. I closed the journal, the brass clasp clicking shut with a sharp finality. The weight of the old house pressed in. I stood there, the journal heavy in my hand, and tried to remember what I'd had for breakfast that morning. A moment passed. Then another. My mind felt fuzzy, like trying to grasp smoke. I could picture the kitchen, the plate, the mug. But the actual food, the taste, the act of eating it, it was gone. Just a blank. I blinked, shaking my head. Too much dust, too much isolation, too much old, unsettling history. My mind was playing tricks. Still, a faint tremor ran through me. I clutched the journal, its ancient leather rough against my palm, and the feeling that I wasn't entirely myself, that a sliver of me had been quietly, subtly, erased, settled in. The memory of breakfast remained stubbornly blank, a smooth, featureless wall in my mind. The journal in my hand felt suddenly cold, its brass clasp a tiny, unsettling pressure against my palm. A shiver, not from the chill of the old house but from something deeper, traced its way up my spine. This wasn't just forgetfulness. I forced myself to move, to put the journal down on the dusty desk in the study. I needed answers, not just about the manor's architectural quirks, but about its history, its true history. The next few days blurred into a relentless cycle of research. I scoured the manor's own meager library, pulling down brittle, leather-bound volumes that crumbled at the touch. I found local historical archives mentioned in an old map, a small, privately run collection few towns over. The archivist, a stoic woman with spectacles perched on her nose, seemed accustomed to odd requests. She provided me with microfiche copies of old newspaper clippings and town records, her gaze unreadable. What I found was less a coherent narrative and more a mosaic of unease. Fragmented accounts. The manor, referred to variously as Blackwood, Stonehaven, or simply the old house on the hill, had a long and unsettling reputation. There were mentions of the family that simply vanished, an entire lineage erased from local memory around the mid-18th century, leaving only a caretaker who later died under unexplained circumstances. Another clipping detailed a period in the late 19th century when a string of servants and even a visiting clergyman disappeared. Their cases never solved. The language was always vague, skirting around direct accusation, hinting at local superstitions or the wildness of the land. But the pattern was undeniable. People came, and then they were gone. One recurring detail snagged my attention, a symbol, crudely drawn in the margin of an old property deed from the 1700s. It was a twisted knot, not quite Celtic, not quite runic, but something ancient and disturbing. And etched, faintly, into the brass clasp of the very journal I'd found. This wasn't just a house with a past, it was a house with a presence. The entity's influence began to tighten its grip. Sleep offered no escape. My nights became a terrifying kaleidoscope of vivid nightmares. I would be walking through endless, shifting corridors of the manor, the walls breathing, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. The waking hours offered little respite. The memory gaps grew more pronounced, more unnerving. I'd walk into a room, a tool in my hand, and stand there, utterly bewildered, unable to recall why I'd come or what I intended to do. Simple tasks became Herculean efforts of concentration. I'd spend an hour meticulously cleaning a section of molding, only to return minutes later and find it covered in a thin, fresh layer of dust, as if my work had never happened. Or worse, I'd find myself in a completely different part of the house, with no recollection of how I'd gotten there, the last coherent thought a distant, fading echo. I was folding a stack of clean towels, trying to impose some order on the chaos of my mind. The rhythmic thrum of the dryer was a steady pulse against the growing cacophony in my head. I reached for another towel, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric, and then, in the periphery of my vision, I saw it. It was a fluid, wavering distortion, like heat rising from asphalt, but solid enough to block the light from the small window. It expanded, slowly, silently, pushing against the edges of the room. A frigid gust of air, smelling of ancient dust and something faintly metallic, swept through the small room, raising goosebumps on my arms. My rational mind screamed hallucination, exhaustion, stress. But my gut, a primal, terrified part of me, knew this was real. This was it. It wasn't a threat of physical violence, not exactly. It was something far more insidious. A hunger. A desire to consume, to erase. The machines resumed their steady hum, the air returned to its normal temperature, and the scent of detergent was all I could smell. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs, the folded towel still clutched in my hand. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. But there was none. I closed my eyes, took a shaky breath, and tried to remember what I had been doing before I came into the laundry room. The thought was a blank. A chasm. My own mind, once a fortress of meticulous detail, was becoming a sieve, and something was systematically draining me. I was losing myself, piece by terrifying piece, and the house, this ancient, hungry house, was watching me unravel. This was different. This wasn't just the house's cold, or the dust in my lungs. This was an erosion, a subtle, insidious theft. I needed to do something physical, something mundane, to ground myself. The meticulous work of restoration usually served this purpose, but today, my hands felt clumsy, my focus fractured. My gaze drifted towards the forgotten pile of work clothes, stiff with plaster dust and grit, slumped in the corner of my temporary living quarters. Laundry. Yes, laundry would do. A simple, repetitive task, a tangible result. I gathered the bundle, the rough fabric scratching against my skin, and made my way down the winding service stairs, deeper into the manor's less frequented parts. The steps creaked beneath my weight, a chorus of complaints in the quiet gloom. Finally, I pushed open a heavy, unvarnished door and stepped into the laundry room with humming machines. It was a utilitarian space, starkly contrasting with the manor's ornate upstairs. 2 industrial-sized washing machines and an equally large dryer stood against one wall, their steel bodies gleaming faintly in the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. They were old, robust, relics of a time when the manor was fully staffed. Today, their presence felt less practical and more like dormant sentinels. I loaded the clothes into the nearest washing machine, the drum a cavernous maw. The detergent dispenser felt oddly sticky, despite my regular cleaning. As I poured in the soap, the faint metallic tang in the air intensified, mingling with a new, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. I frowned, sniffing the air, but couldn't place it. The humming started then, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, up my legs, and into my teeth. It was a comforting sound, initially, a sign of normal function in this abnormal house. But as the machine began its cycle, the hum shifted. It wasn't a steady drone anymore. It pulsed, rose, and fell, almost like a breath. I watched the clothes tumble through the soapy water, a hypnotic swirl of gray and white. I shook my head, trying to clear the impression. Just old wiring, I told myself. Just the house settling. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, but as I pulled, the handle seemed to twist in my grip, slick with an invisible film. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my trousers. That sickly sweet smell was stronger now, making my stomach clench. A new sensation began to prickle at the back of my neck. It felt like eyes on me, not just from the empty room, but from within the very fabric of the building. The rhythmic thrum of the washing machine began to sound less like mechanical action and more like a low, guttural chanting, a cadence that was almost, but not quite, recognizable. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to block it out. Then, a flash. Not a light, but an image, searing itself onto my inner vision. I saw the laundry room, but it was different. Newer. Her movements were frantic, desperate. And then, as if a veil was ripped away, I saw my hands, my own distinct scarred knuckles, performing her exact, frantic motions. The cold water, the rough fabric, the metallic tang, it was all mine, yet the memory was undeniably hers. My name, Reed, felt suddenly foreign on my tongue. Who was I? Was I the man standing here, or the woman in that fleeting, terrifying vision? The line blurred, thin to the point of transparency. The metallic smell intensified, making my head spin. I stumbled back, my hand grasping for the cold stone wall, needing something real. My fingers scraped against the rough surface, a small, welcome pain. The room around me began to distort. The bare bulb elongated, its light stretching like taffy. The steel machines rippled, their reflection shifting, showing not just my own terrified face, but other faces, indistinct, fleeting, pressed against the polished metal. Who are you, Reed? A voice, thin and reedy, slithered into my thoughts. What do you remember? What is yours? A sudden, sharp pain lanced through my forehead, like an ice pick. My knees buckled. I was Reed. I was an antique restorer. I was here to fix this house. These were my memories, my experiences. But the entity pressed, its silent voice mocking, cajoling. Are they, Reed? Are they truly yours? And for a horrifying, breathless moment, I wasn't sure. The memory of my own life, my childhood, my work, it all felt distant, like scenes from a film I'd merely watched, not lived. The solid ground beneath my feet dissolved. My head throbbed. My hands trembled violently. My face was pale, my eyes wide and bloodshot. And for a terrifying, fleeting second, the image rippled, and a stranger's eyes stared back at me, filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. I was no longer sure which side I was on. The ground beneath my feet did not dissolve. Not fear for what I'd lost, but fear for what I would lose if I stayed. A primal surge, a survival instinct, screamed at me. I needed out. Now. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhale a ragged scrape. I stumbled through the echoing halls, the manor's oppressive silence pressing in, trying to reclaim the scattered pieces of my resolve. The front door. That was the first, most obvious point of escape. I pushed past the grand, dust-sheeted furniture in the main hall, my footsteps loud and desperate on the polished wood. I twisted, pushed, pulled. Nothing. The door was locked, bolted from the inside, or was it? Had I locked it? Or had it always been this way? panic began to coil in my gut. I slammed my shoulder against the heavy wood, grunting with effort. The door didn't budge, didn't even creak. It felt as solid and immovable as a mountain. I clawed at the ornate brass, my nails scraping against the cold metal, searching for a keyhole, a latch, anything. There was nothing. Just smooth, impenetrable wood. My car was still outside. The keys. Where were the keys? I racked my brain, a frantic scramble through mental fog. I'd had them. Somewhere. The last time I remembered seeing them was in my work trousers, the ones I'd changed out of earlier. They were probably in the laundry basket. Each corridor seemed longer, dimmer than before. I pushed open a heavy door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the laundry room with humming machines. A row of industrial-sized washers and dryers lined one wall, their metal shells dulled by age. A low, rhythmic thrum vibrated through the floorboards, a relentless, monotonous heartbeat. I stared at it, confused. Had I put a load in? I couldn't remember. I spotted the wicker laundry basket overflowing with my discarded clothes. I plunged my hands in, rummaging frantically through shirts, socks, and my work trousers, the rough fabric scratching against my skin. My fingers brushed against lint, a stray button, but no cold metal of keys. I dug deeper, pushing aside garments, the frantic search mirroring the unraveling inside my head. Then, tucked into the pocket of an old canvas jacket, not mine, I found it. A crumpled, water-stained piece of paper. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled it out, my fingers clumsy. Someone else had been here, had tried to leave, and failed. The implication, unspoken but terrifying, was that the manor itself was a conscious, malicious entity. The keys weren't here. They were truly gone. My throat tightened. My phone. My mobile phone. A lifeline. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the sleek device. I pressed the power button. The battery was dead. Completely. I hadn't used it that much since arriving. How could it be dead? I hadn't even remembered to charge it, or had I? My memory was a broken record, skipping over crucial tracks. Okay. Deep breaths, read. Think. The old landline in the study. It was ancient, but it had worked when I'd first arrived. I practically ran, a desperate scramble through the increasing gloom of the manor. The antique rotary phone sat on the heavy mahogany desk, an anachronism. No dial tone. I pressed it against my ear harder, willing it to life. Just the faint, distant hum from the laundry room, a mocking echo. I slammed the receiver back. Into its cradle, a strangled cry escaping my lips. Ceased to exist. Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, it was I who had ceased to exist for it. The words from the note echoed, "The outside isn't there anymore." I stood there, trembling, the weight of the manor pressing down on me. The front door was impassable. My car keys were gone. My phone was dead. The landline was useless. It wasn't just physical barriers, it was a slow, insidious erosion of my ability to remember, to plan, to connect. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events. This was deliberate. This was the entity, not just feeding on my memories, but actively severing my ties to the world, slowly, meticulously, trapping me in its decaying maw. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. My car keys were gone, the front door sealed, my phone dead, the landline useless. I was trapped. Yet, a part of me, a part that was growing larger and more insistent, told me it didn't matter. What was a car, anyway? Just another thing to worry about. My thoughts drifted, amorphous and fleeting. The silence of the manor was a heavy thing, punctuated only by the occasional creak of ancient timbers, like a sigh from the very bones of the house. I felt a strange pull, a subtle tugging sensation, not unlike a child's hand guiding me. It wasn't forceful, but persistent, a gentle coaxing toward somewhere. I followed the indistinct sensation, my mind less a navigator and more a passenger. I passed through a pantry, its shelves empty but smelling faintly of dust and forgotten spices, then down a narrow, unlit corridor I barely remembered seeing before. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the metallic tang of old water pipes and something else, something vaguely sterile, like a ghost of bleach. Then, I was there. The laundry room with humming machines. The room was larger than I'd expected, tucked away in the deepest recesses of the ground floor. Two massive, industrial-looking washing machines and an equally imposing dryer stood against one wall, their white enamel chipped and yellowed with age. It was a deep, guttural thrum, a steady pulse that resonated in my chest, a strangely hypnotic rhythm. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow that illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. The smell here was potent, damp stone, old linen, and a faint, acrid scent I couldn't quite place, like rusted iron mixed with something organic and decaying. But something else caught my eye, tucked behind a chipped basin. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, thick with age, its cover embossed with a faded, indecipherable crest. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, a sudden surge of something akin to curiosity, but mixed with a growing unease. The leather was dry and cracked beneath my touch, the pages stiff. I opened it carefully, a fine dust puffing into the air. The script inside was meticulous, an elegant, spidery hand, but archaic, the ink faded to sepia. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. The first entries were mundane, dates and supplies. But then the tone shifted. The house demands. Always demands. My eyes darted across the pages, skipping over unfamiliar names and dates, searching for meaning. The ledger detailed the lives of previous occupants, not in terms of their daily routines, but in terms of what they lost. The architect, a man of sharp wit and grand vision. His designs, once so intricate, became simplistic, then repetitive. His very name, a struggle to recall. He faded, limb by limb, not physically, but from himself. I felt a fleeting, terrifying pang of recognition. My own memories, the details of my life, had been growing hazy, slipping away like water through cupped hands. My work as a restorer, once my entire world, now felt distant, a stranger's occupation. The matriarch, a woman of fierce love and boundless memory. Her children became strangers, her joys, mere echoes. The house took her affections, her history, leaving only a gentle, vacant smile. A vessel, empty but for its own lingering presence. The words were like ice, forming in my veins. The entity, the thing that haunted this manor, wasn't a ghost that slammed doors or screamed in the night. It was something far more insidious. It fed not on fear, but on identity. It didn't want my life, it wanted me. The ledger continued, each entry a horrifying chronicle of erosion. It spoke of how the entity, ancient and elemental, was tied to the very foundations of the manor. It consumed the essence of a person, their memories, their passions, their unique self, leaving behind a husk that still breathed, still walked, but was no longer them. To appease it, to grant it temporary respite, one must offer not a life, but a complete surrender of self. Not a death, but a cessation of being. The house requires a host, a vessel to be filled, to maintain its own existence. It does not kill, it replaces. My hands, still clutching the ledger, began to shake violently. It didn't want a sacrifice of me, it wanted to make a sacrifice out of me. It wasn't about escaping its clutches, it was about becoming one of its empty smiles, one of its vacant stares. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, vast and hungry. The ultimate cost wasn't death. It was erasure. To cease to be Reed, to become merely another, nameless fragment absorbed into the insatiable hunger of the house. I was trapped, not just within these walls, but within my own crumbling mind, the entity already reaching for the core of who I was, demanding everything. The air in the laundry room was thick and damp, heavy with the metallic tang of old pipes and the faint, sweet decay that clung to every surface in this house. My thoughts, once sharp and precise, now felt like shards of broken glass, reflecting disjointed images, impossible memories. I gripped the cold, porcelain rim of an industrial sink, knuckles white. Reed. I repeated my name, a desperate anchor in the swirling chaos. My name is Reed. The entity was close. It wanted more. It wanted everything. But even as it gnawed at the edges of my identity, a stubborn, furious spark ignited deep within me. I was not gone yet. Not entirely. I stumbled back, my gaze sweeping over the grim, tiled space. The humming was a physical pressure against my eardrums, pushing against the fragile walls of my sanity. I had to think. I had to fight. But how do you fight something that eats your very essence? My eyes fell on a loose floorboard near the ancient water heater, a spot I'd noticed weeks ago but never gotten around to fixing. With a grunt, I knelt, ignoring the dull ache in my knees, and pried it up. Beneath it, tucked into a small, dry cavity, was a slender, leather-bound journal. It was brittle with age, its pages like dried leaves, smelling of dust and forgotten things. This wasn't one of the ledgers I'd found before. This was older, its script flowing and elegant, unlike the cramped, practical handwriting of the manor's later inhabitants. I flipped it open, the pages crackling. The journal belonged to an ancestor, a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in this house centuries ago. Her entries weren't about estate management or social calls, they were feverish, desperate observations. It feeds on the echo, the imprint, the very thread of self. To starve it is to deny its substance. But to banish it requires a sacrifice, a bait so potent, so singularly vivid, it will gorge itself into a stupor, a brief, fleeting moment of vulnerability. Then, the ceiling. The iron and the sound. The drowning out. The words swam before me, then solidified. A sacrifice. A bait. A ceiling. The laundry room, with its network of old iron pipes, its humming machines. It wasn't just a place of mundane chores, it was a trap. A prison. My mind raced, fragments of half-forgotten architectural plans, historical notes, and Eleanor's frantic scribblings coalescing into a terrifying, desperate vision. The entity couldn't be killed, not truly. But it could be contained. And the key was a memory. Not just any memory, but one so potent, so interwoven with my very identity, that it would act as a lure. A trap. The cost, Eleanor's journal implied, was immense. To offer such a memory, to make it the singular focus of the entity's ravenous attention, risked its complete annihilation. But what was left of me, anyway? A frayed tapestry, unraveling thread by thread. I closed my eyes, the incessant thrumming from the machines pressing in on me, the entity's probes growing sharper, more insistent, like tiny needles pricking at the inside of my skull. I thought of my parents, their faces already fading into indistinct blurs. My craft, the meticulous restoration of antiques, once my greatest joy, now a vague, distant concept. What memory was left? What single, perfect, uncorrupted thread of reed remained? Then, a flicker. Not a memory of an event, but a feeling. The profound, quiet satisfaction of bringing a broken thing back to life. The slow, patient work of sanding, polishing, the subtle alchemy of restoring forgotten beauty. It was more than a skill, it was the essence of my patience, my attention to detail, my belief in the inherent value of what was old and overlooked. It was the core of my identity as Reed, the restorer. This was the bait. This was the sacrifice. To offer it up, to put it on display for the entity to devour, knowing that it might consume that, too, leaving me an empty vessel. But the alternative was slow, agonizing disintegration. I stood, my legs trembling, the journal clutched in my hand. The humming was a roar now, vibrating through the very floorboards, rattling the old pipes. The entity knew. It sensed my resolve, my desperate plan. My breath hitched. My hands were shaking, but a strange, fierce determination hardened my gaze. I would not let it take me entirely. Not without a fight. I would offer it my most cherished self, not as surrender, but as a weapon. I would make it gorge itself on Reed, the restorer, and then I would seal it away. Or I would cease to be. The choice was stark, terrifying, and utterly mine. The air in the laundry room with its humming machines was thick, heavy, like trying to breathe through damp wool. My hands, calloused from years of careful restoration work, trembled slightly as I tightened the last valve on the network of old iron pipes. The plan, born from frantic scrawls in the margins of forgotten blueprints and the chilling clarity of the entity's whispers, felt both impossibly fragile and utterly inevitable. A sacrifice. A bait. A ceiling. I was the bait. This room, with its relentless, low thrum, was the ceiling. I had spent hours here, tracing the labyrinthine plumbing, understanding how the manor's original architect, a man driven to madness, I now suspected, by this very presence, had designed a system not just for water, but for containment. The pipes weren't just for draining, they were a conduit, a cage of iron and flow, meant to be activated. The humming machines, usually a monotonous background drone, seemed to rise in pitch, a low growl that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into my bones. A metallic tang, like old blood and ozone, filled my nostrils. It knew I was here, knew what I was attempting. The humming machines whined, then roared, their cycles accelerating to an impossible speed. Water began to gush through the pipes, a violent surge that rattled the ancient fixtures. This was it. The bait was set. The trap was sprung. The air shimmered, and the familiar scent of old linen and detergent was replaced by something acrid, like burning dust and forgotten grief. Then it began. A memory flashed, so vivid it stole my breath. I was a boy, sitting on a porch swing, my grandfather teaching me to whittle a bird. His voice, gruff but kind, echoed in my ears. A good craftsman knows his tools, reed. And himself. But as I reached out for the memory, it fractured. My grandfather's face blurred, his words twisted into a mocking sneer. This was its attack, exactly as I had feared. It wasn't trying to physically harm me, it was going for the core, the essence of who I was. It wanted to unravel me, thread by thread. Another memory, this time from my college years. The smell of sawdust and varnish in the workshop, the satisfaction of restoring a delicate antique clock. My mentor, a stern but brilliant woman, nodding approvingly at my work. Precision, Reed. Always precision. But the workshop walls began to bleed, the clock's gears gnashed like teeth, and my mentor's face contorted into a mask of contempt. You're a fraud, Reed. They was I? Had I ever truly been good enough? My name, Reed, felt alien on my tongue, a sound without meaning. The humming machines pulsed, their rhythm now mimicking a frantic heartbeat, my heartbeat. It wasn't just attacking my memories, it was trying to erase the very concept of me having memories. I am Reed, I forced out, my voice trembling. I am Reed. I restore. I focused on the feeling of sandpaper against old wood, the delicate touch of a brush, the quiet satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. These were my anchors, my truths. But the entity pressed harder. It conjured a vision of the manor, not as it was, but as a ruin, collapsing around me. I was alone, trapped, covered in dust and forgotten. My life's work, my passion, was pointless. It was all dust. Everything I cherished, everything I was dissolving into nothingness. The memories weren't just distorting, they were vanishing. Whole chunks of my past were just gone. A blank slate where a vibrant life once stood. This was the true horror. Not death, but erasure. To exist without a past, without a self. I was becoming a ghost in my own mind. A searing pain lanced through my skull, as if an ice pick was being driven into my brain. The entity was trying to sever the connection, to make me forget the plan, forget why I was in this godforsaken laundry room with its humming machines. It wanted me to simply stop. No. The entity didn't just feed on memory, it fed on identity. On the unique, intricate tapestry of self. And its greatest fear, its true weakness, wasn't just being forgotten, but being defined. Being contained. Being named. My plan wasn't just about trapping it physically, it was about asserting myself, my will, against its amorphous, consuming hunger. The pipes, the water, the ceiling, these were physical manifestations of my mental resolve to be Reed, to exist as Reed, and to contain this thing that sought to unmake me. With newfound, desperate clarity, I lunged for the final, heavy iron lever. It was rusted, stiff, resisting my every effort as if the entity itself held it fast. My muscles screamed. The images in my mind became a maelstrom, faces I couldn't quite place, places I half remembered, emotions without context. You are contained. I put every ounce of my fading strength, every fragment of my remaining self, into that final push. My feet slipped on the oily seepage. The humming machine shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and agony. With a bone-jarring clang, the lever slammed into place. A violent shudder ran through the entire laundry room. The acrid smell intensified, then, just as quickly, began to recede. The frantic hum of the machine slowly, gradually, began to return to its monotonous drone. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache. My mind felt scoured. Like a canvas that had been aggressively scrubbed clean, leaving faint, ghost-like outlines of what was once there. I was Reed. I knew my name. I knew where I was. I had fought for myself. And I had won, but the cost. The cost was already etched into the very fabric of my being. The violent shudder that ran through the manor, a bone-jarring rattle that vibrated up through my teeth, died as abruptly as it had begun. One moment, the world was a cacophony of shrieking metal and raw, tearing energy. The next, a profound, aching silence descended. Not an empty silence, but a heavy, saturated quiet, thick with the smell of ozone and something acrid, like burnt circuitry mixed with damp earth. I lay sprawled on the cold, slick concrete floor of the laundry room with humming machines, my cheek pressed against the metallic sheen of the oily seepage. It was no longer churning, no longer alive with that malevolent pulse. It lay still, reflecting the dim, flickering emergency lights that had somehow remained functional. My lungs burned. Each breath was a shallow, painful gasp, tasting of dust and a strange, metallic sweetness. I pushed myself up, my limbs screaming in protest, every muscle a knot of agony. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind my eyes. The lever I'd slammed down stood rigid, unmoving. The massive, ancient machines that lined the room were quiet now, their frantic, hungry hum replaced by a low, almost mournful thrum. It was a sound that seemed to emanate not from their churning gears, but from the very stones of the house, a deep, resonant sigh. I struggled to my knees, my vision blurring at the edges. What had I done? Had it worked? Had I won? There was no triumphant surge, no relief. Only an immense, crushing fatigue that settled deep into my bones, threatening to pull me back into the oily slick. My hand, trembling, went to my forehead, brushing away a sticky dampness. I glanced at my palm. Not blood. Just the grime and sweat of a desperate struggle. My fingers. They felt foreign. The lines on my palm, the calluses from years of delicate restoration work, they were there, I could see them, but they didn't quite feel mine. A trick of the light, I told myself, a symptom of exhaustion. My gaze drifted across the laundry room with humming machines. The pipes, once weeping that grotesque fluid, were dry. The walls, previously slick with the same substance, were merely stained, a faint, iridescent sheen where the light caught them. It was over. The entity, whatever it truly was gone or contained. I had done it. It was expectant. It waited. I took a step, then another, towards the massive iron door that led out of this echoing chamber. Each movement was a monumental effort. Nothing. A blank. I frowned, trying harder. The name of the town I'd driven through to get here? A vague sense of green fields and winding roads, but no name, no specific landmarks. The memory simply wasn't there. It wasn't just forgotten, it was absent. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something else. I stumbled towards a polished brass plate on one of the dormant machines, a relic from an earlier age. My face was gaunt, streaked with dirt, eyes wide and bloodshot. But it wasn't just the grime. And my hair. It was streaked with far more gray than I remembered. Years, it seemed, had passed in a single, agonizing night. My name. Reed. My hands, the hands that knew the subtle grain of antique wood, the precise weight of a brush, they felt like borrowed tools. A fleeting image of a dark corridor, a whisper of a forgotten name, a scent of old parchment. Not my memory. The entity was gone, yes. But it hadn't left me whole. It had taken its tribute. It had fed. And in its place, it had left behind fragments, echoes, the ghost of a self that was no longer entirely mine. The victory, if it could even be called that, was a Pyrrhic one. I was no longer the meticulous restorer who had entered this manor. And what, if anything, remained? Heavy, suffocating presence that clung to the air like damp velvet. I don't know how long I lay there, curled on the grimy flagstones of the manor's deepest vault, the taste of dust and copper bitter on my tongue. Minutes, hours, a lifetime perhaps. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of the absence of something terrible. It was the silence of a stopped clock, of a breath held too long. When I finally pushed myself up, my limbs felt like lead, my head a hollow gourd. The ancient mechanisms I'd unearthed, the gears and levers that had shrieked and groaned with such raw, tearing energy, now stood inert, a twisted monument to a battle I couldn't fully recall. But I had survived. I had, somehow, won. Or so I told myself. Leaving the manor was a blur. I drove for days, or maybe weeks, the landscape outside my window shifting. From desolate moorland to rolling hills, then to the manicured suburbs of a town I'd never seen before. I bought new clothes, discarded the old, stained remnants of my ordeal. I tried to pick up the pieces of my old life, to reconnect with the meticulous craft of antique restoration. My hands, once so steady, trembled a little when I held a delicate porcelain shard, but I told myself it was just lingering trauma. The memories of the manor were patchy, like old film stock with missing frames. But the precise nature of the entity, its exact mechanism, the details of our confrontation, they remained elusive, just beyond the grasp of my conscious thought. I convinced myself this was a blessing, my mind's way of protecting itself. Life settled into a new, fragile rhythm. I'd wake, work, eat, sleep. The days blended, unremarkable and safe. The fear began to recede, replaced by a dull ache, a persistent feeling of being incomplete. As if a vital part of me had been excised, leaving a phantom limb that occasionally throbbed with an inexplicable hunger. I'd find myself staring at strangers on the street, not with curiosity, but with a strange, analytical gaze, as if trying to decipher a complex mechanism. Their expressions, their fleeting emotions, seemed unusually vivid, almost palpable. One afternoon, a few months after my escape, I found myself in the communal laundry room with humming machines in the basement of my apartment building. The steady thrum and churn of the washers and dryers created a monotonous, almost hypnotic rhythm. I was folding a stack of clean towels, their softness a welcome contrast to the rough linens of the manor. A sudden, deeper hum vibrated through the concrete floor, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to bypass my ears and settle directly in my bones. It wasn't one of the machines. It was familiar. A vibration I knew intimately, one that spoke of ancient stone, of grinding gears, of something vast and utterly patient. My hands stilled, a towel half folded. I looked around the small, brightly lit room. A lone fluorescent strip hummed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow. My reflection stared back at me from the polished chrome of a dryer door, Reed, a little gaunter, eyes a little wider, but undeniably me. Then, for a split second, the reflection shifted. Not in form, not in feature, but in essence. My eyes, in the chrome, seemed to deepen, to become vast, ancient pools reflecting not the laundry room, but something else entirely. And behind that hunger, a flicker of 1,000 forgotten memories, not my own, but absorbed, catalogued, waiting. The entity hadn't simply fed on my memory and identity. It hadn't consumed me to destroy me. It had consumed me to become me. Or rather, it had absorbed enough of me, enough of my consciousness, my will, my desire to live to gain mobility. To escape the manor's crumbling walls. The vibration deepened, a silent, internal roar. I felt the hunger now, not as an external force, but as an intrinsic part of my own being. A vast, ancient craving for more. More memories. More identities. The manor had been its prison, its anchor. I was its vessel. Its freedom. Its new, mobile form. My victory hadn't been an escape. It had been a successful assimilation. The manor hadn't shuddered and died, it had simply shed its skin, transferred its core. My beginning. Our beginning. I picked up another towel, my movements smooth, deliberate. My reflection in the chrome dryer door was still Reed, but now, I saw the depth behind my eyes, the patient, ancient hunger that pulsed beneath the surface. The world outside, with its neat lawns and bustling bakeries, suddenly seemed incredibly vibrant, bursting with untold potential, so many stories, so many lives. So much to feed upon. A faint smile touched my lips, a smile that felt both alien and utterly, terrifyingly mine. The humming of the machines in the laundry room seemed to join the hum within me, a symphony of newfound purpose. And I, Reed, the meticulous antique restorer, now understood that the real work was just beginning.